Ghibli films have always had a unique place in my mind. Whether it's the pastoral visuals, fantastical story, or the rich atmosphere, they've always had a niche that nothing else seems to fit in. And I think that it comes down to this unique aesthetic that is created through the combination of visual and audio components. Whilst the visuals are just as much a part of the experience of Ghibli, I feel that the musical elements make up a much more significant and deeper part of the aesthetic that we associate with Ghibli. Ever since watching the films as a kid, and even now, the music is always prominent for me, and that's not just because I'm a music student. I feel that it's safe to assume that most people who enjoy Ghibli films share this opinion, whether it's Sampo from My Neighbor Totoro or the Merry-Go-Round of Life Waltz from Howl's Moving Castle. The music is one of the aspects of the films that stick with us the most. The music evokes a combined sense of nostalgia and otherworldliness for me. And perhaps some of that's my bias from watching Ghibli a lot as a kid, but I still think it applies for a lot of people who enjoy Ghibli. It has both familiarity and a sense of differentness that only further leans into that nostalgia vibe. However, one thing that often comes to mind for me is the idea that Ghibli films both sound and feel Japanese. And this is sometimes in contrast to just how European, non-Japanese, or just how plainly fantastical some of the film settings are. Of course, some of the films like Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke are deeply rooted both visually and narratively in Japanese folklore, so in those cases it's hardly surprising that they exude Japaneseness. However, even for films like Howl's Moving Castle with its Belle Epoque setting, and even Porco Rosso which is explicitly set in Italy, I can't help but feel that they all exude an underlying sense of the Japanese aesthetic. Sure, we can point to the pseudo-anime art style, the branding, and the fact that all the characters are speaking Japanese, but I feel that this would just be a superficial explanation, and would be a disservice to the creators. I think that there is a much more interesting series of factors that we can dive into and explore in order to grasp at that Japanese aesthetic and how it permeates the sound and feel of Ghibli films. Saying that, as the music is such a significant part of the feel of Studio Ghibli, I think that looking into the music will provide insight into why Ghibli sounds Japanese. So I've decided that I wanted to explore the music of Studio Ghibli in more detail, going into the history, theory, and culture behind it, and asking, what is the sound of Ghibli films, and does it sound Japanese? First off, just to clarify a few things, this is a pretty open-ended question, and I don't intend to come to a definitive conclusion, so no black or white answers I'm afraid. But I do intend to present an argument based on my observations of Ghibli films, its music, and its connection to Japanese culture. Do let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and feel free to disagree. For now, let's get started with a brief overview of Ghibli itself, just to get an idea of where the company and its artistic continuity comes from. Founded on June 15th, 1985 by directors Hayao Miyazaki, Isao Takahata, and producer Toshio Suzuki, Studio Ghibli is now a well-established animation film company based in Kogane, Tokyo. The company was founded after the success of the film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, or Kaze no Tani no Nausicaa, a film worked on and directed by Hayao Miyazaki in 1984. The film Nausicaa was also the start of the long collaboration with the composer and arranger Joe Hisaishi, aka Mamoru Fujisawa, the mastermind behind the sound of Ghibli movies. Whilst Nausicaa is technically not a Studio Ghibli film, since it was worked on by both Miyazaki and Hisaishi, as well as carrying the same aesthetic and style, it's usually considered part of the Ghibli canon. Ever since Nausicaa, the two have worked closely on many films, Hisaishi having worked on all but one of Miyazaki's films. Hisaishi himself started his path to music playing violin from the age of 4, leading to him attending the Kunitachi College of Music, majoring in music composition, where he received formal musical training in Western classical theory and styles. This will be relevant in a later video. By 1983, Hisaishi had written music for 4 different animes, as well as releasing an art album. MK Muk? I have no idea how to read this out. MK Waju. As well as an electropop minimalist album called Information. These successes led to him then being recommended to compose an image album in 1983 for Nausicaa, which, while beginning his long career at Ghibli, also highlights a distinctly Japanese aspect of the studio's filmmaking process. Now, image albums. You might be wondering what an image album is, and I've got a short description of its relevance to Studio Ghibli. Quote, "For each film, Hisaishi is given a bit of text, the music memo, explaining the film and its characters, and from that information writes an image album, which is usually released about a year in advance of the film, sometimes before even a trailer is out." So, an image album is a full album of music which is written early on or pre-production, and is released ahead of even the trailer for the film, as part of the promotion process. This is a uniquely Japanese practice which emphasises the importance of the music in the finished animation, as the music written is based on only a gist of what the animation is about, as well as storyboards and character concepts, and is subsequently used to inform the animators in how the finished product should feel. The image album is also important in the sense that the early release is done in order to introduce the audience to the acoustic feel of the soundtrack/movie. This means that the music written in the image album at the start of the production process cannot be significantly changed in order to maintain that continuity from the image album to the final soundtrack. Sure, in the sense of orchestration and instrumentation there'll be changes, just like that change from synth to orchestra just then, but the melodies, harmonies, and the feel has to stay consistent. The composers, more specifically Joe Hisaishi, can add new tracks and sections to what they wrote in the image album for the final score, but they can't take anything away from what they wrote in the original image album. Quote, "The musical ideas that emerge within an image album need to become prominent features of the final score, also because of their main commercial purpose, to make the potential audience acquainted with the acoustic atmosphere of the film. In this sense, a lot of the music for Japanese animation is written before the animation itself, without following the rhythms or other precise needs of actual film sequences." Now, all of this means that the music of Ghibli is not written after the production of the visuals to fit exactly what's on the screen, like the jump scare percussion of a Western horror track, or the swooning strings of a romantic scene. Instead, it's focused around character themes, mood music, or scenic music, that tries to present an idea, character, or a more complex feeling over what is shown, as the basis of the music comes from the image album, which was written on the broader concepts of the story and rough concept art, and the final score has to be based on what the image album wrote. Fascinatingly, this doctrine of image albums has its roots in more traditional Japanese arts of gekiban, or more specifically shosa ongaku/geza, which were musical ensembles that accompanied the traditional Japanese theatre arts of no, kabuki, and others offstage. Now, these forms of Japanese theatre, particularly no, have a heavy emphasis on the musical accompaniment as part of the storytelling, where the music would signal to the audience the presence of a character, feeling, or even the change of weather, as well as often providing narration. No is a particularly old form of Japanese theatre, and the final form of it started in the 14th century Muromachi period. As you saw there, in No, the actors are masked, and many of their expressions and actions are presented by stylized gestures and subtle movements. All of this is highly codified under the Nogaku Kyokai, or the Nogaku Performance Association. The actors do also sing or chant lines themselves, however much of the chanting and singing can be done by the musical ensemble offstage as well. No itself is a theatre form based on poetry and old literature, and as a result has a particular focus on the supernatural and spiritual for its narratives. It also means that much of No, including the music, is highly influenced by poetic principles and philosophy. This leads to a lot of the music focusing on virtues and settings, as opposed to following what the actors are physically doing in the moment. And this idea of following a more abstract musical subject and leaving a lot to suggestion is one of the many influences on the practice of image albums. Kabuki is a more recent Japanese theatre art, starting around the 17th century Edo period. As opposed to No, which was very much an upper-class art or form of entertainment, Kabuki was developed from street performances into a popular form of entertainment for the commoner. The stories and subject matter as a result were far more down-to-earth, and often based on history or contemporary stories and issues, leading to a far greater focus on individual characters rather than a greater philosophical concept or a virtue. This is particularly exemplified with the practice called the mie, where main characters strike an audacious pose to establish themselves and what kind of character they are. The music would often line up with this in order to establish the character in the most dramatic way possible. The music from Kabuki initially was simply transferred over from No, which already existed at the time Kabuki was started. However, over time, this developed to become a much more flamboyant ensemble, and the focus of the music became more so the characters and the situations they found themselves in, rather than the vague concepts of No. Thus, the influence of character music and mood music on image albums was born. Now, fundamentally, this notion of signalling character or mood with music sounds similar to the Western tradition of musical emphasis in film, or Mickey Mousing, a one-to-one relationship between music and visuals. The Japanese style of musical accompaniment, however, is more along the lines of commentary, where the music would remark on the scene in a wider sense, rather than following in minute detail what's happening visually. The key difference being that the music doesn't emphasize the comical or superficial aspects of the scene, for example slapstick moments or little motions like in the previous clip. However, it still suits the scene in tone and atmosphere.
カルチファー、お願いしますよ。やだね。おいらは悪魔だ。誰の指図も受けないよ。言うこと聞かないと水をかけちゃうよ。それとも取引のことをハウルにばらそうか。チェ、こんなばあちゃん入れるんじゃなかった。さあ、どうする
？This then frees up the soundtrack to follow its own musical ideas, rather than being strictly tied to the visual. As a result, the music feels more distinct, as the themes and ideas being explored by the soundtrack differs from what you can see. Not enough that it clashes with the visuals, but enough that it becomes its own independent layer in the aesthetic and experience of the films. I think this encapsulates a large part of why the music in Ghibli films stand out to the audience. I think this perspective that the music is just as significant in the storytelling as what can be seen describes the impact of the score in the film perfectly. It feels almost like the music is a companion in the experience of watching Ghibli films, a sort of character itself that stays with you as you're immersed in the story. It reflects the ideas and thoughts one might have when seeing these scenes, yet it remains ambiguous enough that its presence doesn't feel insistent, or that it's trying to force any perspective or feelings onto you. For me, this is one of the many reasons why Ghibli sounds Japanese, as the mindset and philosophy about the writing process and the role and significance of the music is so unique to the Japanese, and as a result, contrasts so much with other popular forms of animation. So, in this video, we covered the broad history of Studio Ghibli itself and the history of Joe Hisaishi, along with the process of image albums and its roots in the traditional Japanese approach to music and drama. This video is the first in a series I'm doing on the music and sound of Ghibli films, so stick around for more videos to continue on this topic. I'll be covering other points in my other videos, but what do you think? Do you feel that Studio Ghibli films sound Japanese? And if so, do you think this partly explains why it does? At the end of this series, I'll be posting the full series of videos combined into one, so do hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon if you'd like to be kept posted. Thanks for watching, and do tell me your thoughts in the comments below.